Hello, it's been a while since I've talked about some books, so let's talk about some books. I have taken some time because I read two books in January, but I decided not to make a video about my January reads for two reasons. One is because I read two books, and the other reason is because I did a video about Golden Full, which is one of the books, a 1.5 hour vlog of that book. And yes, it is full of spoilers. But I feel like I talked about the book to death, and so to make a video where half of it was being redundant about my thoughts about it, even though it would be spoiler free, just didn't feel quite appropriate. And then the other book that I read in the month of January is The Citadel of the Autarch by Wolfe, which is book 4 in Book of the New Sun. And I didn't want to do a video about that yet because I thought I'd make a video about Book of the New Sun in general, a separate video. So basically for my two January reads, I thought I'm just going to make separate videos about both books, and I already did my Golden Full vlog. But as far as my thoughts about Book of the New Sun, I thought about it. I thought about making a video about my Book of the New Sun journey so far, but I'm reading Earth of the New Sun this next month. In fact, I just started it like yesterday. So I think I'm going to wait until I finish Earth of the New Sun, which I'm buddy reading with Jake from Nerd Level Rising as usual, before giving my full thoughts about this series so far. And yes, I understand there are other books in this world even beyond that, but I'm probably going to stop at Earth of the New Sun, I imagine. So as far as what I could say about the last book in Book of the New Sun, however, about Citadel of the Autarch, is that it delivers on what I expected it to deliver, meaning that you get to the end of the book and it recontextualizes everything you read before. I was expecting that. I think that it still delivered somehow, even with that expectation, and even with seeing certain hints along the way. But I have to say that it wasn't my favorite of Book of the New Sun. I started out loving it. I thought there were certainly some really cool sections of that book, specifically a towering house that, if you know, you know, when you go upstairs. And I loved that part, and I loved some of the imagery, some of the descriptions of things. However, I found myself not as into the book somehow. Somehow my investment waned a little bit in the second half. Not that I was disliking the book, but I just felt a little bit less momentum somehow in the second half. And then the stuff at the end was really, really cool. But I didn't feel like this big emotional wave from the series. Not that I was totally expecting that, because this isn't really an emotional type of experience. I don't think it's meant to be in that way. But I guess because I was just so swept away and so excited for so many different parts of the story, especially the third book, The Sword of the Lictor, I was expecting to be like more on a high than I was at the end of the book. It certainly was mind reeling for sure, but it didn't quite sweep me away to the extent that I was expecting, like I said. And I know it did for Jake, however. I think Jake has even gotten the Folio Edition Society books and a tattoo. I'm not quite there. I have no tattoos on my body. But yeah, I'm glad I read it though, and I am curious about moving on into Earth of the New Sun. Okay, going on from here though, Golden Full, as I said, I did an 1.5 hour vlog of this book, and I absolutely loved it. Just absolutely brilliant character writing, to the point where I was in the first half of this book thinking, is Hobb one of the best character writers in all of fiction? And I don't even mean just fantasy, I mean all of fiction. Now, granted, there is a lot I have not read outside of fantasy that has stunning character work, I imagine, but I truly think she is gifted. I truly think she is a master of character work, and I am eager to read on. I am going to take a little bit of a break before I get to Fool's Fate, but I will be vlogging it. Thank you so much to those of you who watch those vlogs. They are a labor of love in some ways because it takes a long time to string together those thoughts. But I do appreciate it, especially as they do not get a lot of attention on YouTube, which is understandable. I mean, it's like, what, book 8 in a long epic fantasy series full of spoilers? But I do greatly appreciate you all the same, those of you who've watched, and I've been so touched by your comments. Okay, I'm going to talk about the next couple of books fairly briefly, and one of those being Chess Story by Stefan Zweig. This is a book that I first heard about from Murphy Napier. She couldn't stop talking about this book last year, It is very short, practically a short story, maybe novella length. I think like the first book club choice, which was Blind Sight by Peter Watts, I ended up enjoying this more than the others. However, Evie and Josh both said that they enjoyed this all the more after we talked about it. Now, I don't want to talk about it too much here because we did talk about it in that discussion. And in fact, we spoke about it spoiler free for quite some time. So if you want to have more general thoughts about this book, I'm going to point you to that video, which is here on my channel. But I'll just say here for the record, I read this and I really enjoyed it. And in fact, I had a wonderful discussion with Thomas R. Howell. I think that was last weekend, and we talked about things we're loving in books right now. And this was one of the things I chose, or one of the things I chose, I should say, is contrasts in books. And I feel like this book is such a great depiction of symbolic contrast with the chess pieces, the chessboard, but it's also incredible character contrast with the two characters that we get to know in this story. And there is so much gradation within those contrasts. So it's not just very simplistic in any way. I feel like we go into depth and have some really interesting storytelling in a short page count. I thought it was very well told. So again, check out that discussion if you're interested, and I highly recommend checking this out. It is so short, well worth it. One more book to talk about very briefly, and that is going to be A Song for Arbonne by Guy Gavriel Kay. This was a reread for me. This is my favorite fantasy standalone of all time. I'm not considering Lord of the Rings a standalone, by the way. I know some people do, but this is my favorite fantasy standalone. I read this a couple of years ago, adored it at the time. I have a review on my channel. And after my reread, I watched my review and I'm not proud of it now. I feel like I didn't capture half the significance of what this book does. And maybe that's because so much of the beauty of this book is in the details, even to the point where Guy Gavriel Kay changes his narrative voice. He writes in present tense in one society and he writes in past tense with the other society. Little details like that. It's best discussed in a spoiler-filled discussion, which is going to happen, by the way, on Philip Chase's channel. I'm going to be part of a spoiler-filled discussion with Philip Chase. He's reading all the Guy Gavriel Kay books in order alongside Evan from The Nerd Writer. So we're going to be having a fantastic discussion. I know Josh from Red Fairy Books is joining us, and I am excited to talk about this one again because, like I said, there's just so much to it. There is an eloquence to Guy Gavriel Kay's prose that just stands above most other fantasy writers, in my opinion. And so I'm very excited to talk about it in more detail on Philip's channel. That should happen at the end of March, so look out for that. Delusion's Master by Tanith is book 3 in Tales of the Flat Earth. This was published in 1981. And I already talked extensively about this series in my last wrap-up, so I'll link that in case you want more details about Tales of the Flat Earth. And maybe I'll do a separate video at some point talking about this series. But basically in each installment, we feature a different god. So the first installment featured this under-earth prince, this hell realm prince named Osron, who's always in the story, actually. He's featured in all the books so far. And then in book 2, we strongly feature death personified. And then in this installment, we have Delusion. And Delusion is described as having half a face that is very handsome and elegant, and the other half that is distorted and grotesque, which sounds very familiar. It sounds almost like a comic book character. I'm sure there is one out there. But at the same time, as Tanith writes these god characters that sound so cliche when I describe them, they don't feel cliche in her writing. Somehow she's able to blend these characters perfectly and seamlessly into the narrative without it feeling generic. Somehow she makes it work. And I think it's because she just has a masterful hand at her prose, at her writing. I've been giving some thought lately as to why I enjoy gods in some stories and not others. And I think it all comes down to the writing and how cohesive they feel in the world. And in this case, they really do feel part of this ethereal world. It is very stylized, almost like watching a claymation animation versus watching a live action story. And the god of delusion, very specifically in this story, is dealing with religious themes. There are some pretty on the nose biblical stuff going on, like there's a Tower of Babyloo. It's not even subtle at all, some of the biblical things in here. But delusion dealing with zealotry. Another angle to this story is that of desire and how attainment of one's desire can bring bliss and ecstasy, and at the same time, that can be shadowed by doubt. It could be shadowed by the fear of loss. Delusion's Master is probably not my favorite book in the Flat Earth series so far, but I still had a great time with it and look forward to continuing on with Delirium's Mistress. I think that's the next one I have to get to. Black Sun Rising by C.S. Friedman is book 1 in the Coldfire trilogy, and this was first published in 1984. I was so excited to get to this book, and I'm sad to say it didn't totally work for me, and I'll explain why. But before I do, I'm going to give broad strokes of what we're dealing with. We're on a planet called Urna. This is in the far future. Humans have colonized this planet. This is a planet where we have different moon cycles. I believe there are 2 moons on this planet, if I'm not mistaken. But every once in a while, we have what's called a true night, where the planet goes completely black. Then we also have this Fey magic on the planet. Now, the Fae are not these little winged humanoid creatures that you might imagine from fairy tales. It's more like a life force energy that corresponds to the different environmental aspects. So you have Earth Fae, you have tidal Fae that go along with the ocean, so and so forth. And this Fae magic can be used by sorcerers. It can be worked with a capital W to create these wardings to make objects more sustainable or to prolong human life. And meanwhile, there's a religion on this planet that is trying to utilize faith rather than sorcery against this Fae magic. But the problem with the Fae magic is that the Fae feeds on human emotion, specifically human fear. So it taps into people's worst nightmares, and it could be used in a very negative way against people. Meanwhile, there are other types of beings on this planet. I won't go into the weeds about that, but we do have demons. We do have this other race of humanoids. So fast forward here, I'll just go ahead and say this. I loved the prologue of this book. The prologue of this book is my favorite part of the entire story. I think it was so fascinating. I was immediately drawn in. I was so excited about where this story would go. And sadly, I had so many mixed feelings after that, mostly, like I said, negative. And I will say that I'm going to have more detailed thoughts in a discussion over on Tori's channel. We're going to be talking about this with John from Talking Story and Anita Gata, and I think that's going to happen at the end of March. What didn't work for me was what I felt like forced melodrama in the prose. This is not to say that Friedman is a poor writer, but her writing choices did not work for my taste in the sense that she uses a lot of one-word sentences for dramatic effect. Darkness, fire, cold fire. And then she'll usually have a bunch of fragmented sentences after that could have been just one sentence. And I understand she's just trying to force the drama and the emotion and heighten things, but I feel like it was too much too fast. I didn't feel any buildup for some of the things that happened at the beginning. And as a result, I felt very disconnected and detached from the characters. Now, I say all that, the tone and the characterization just feeling a little bit artificial for me is, I think, the best way to describe it. It felt artificial. And yet, at the same time, I think that Friedman has a gift when it comes to writing settings. And it started to click for me when the characters were directly interacting with the setting. Those were the parts of the story that I tended to enjoy the most, aside from the prologue, which I thought was just, again, excellent. And I think there's some of that in the prologue as well. But other times I felt like she was describing these incredibly vivid settings, and yet I didn't feel like the characters were part of it. It was almost like they were just kind of seeing it. There was a little bit like an earthquake raising a character's libido, but otherwise I feel like it started, like I said, it started to click for me more in the second half of the book. But then as I read on, I don't know, I just found myself not as interested. I think it's a very detailed storyline in terms of what she was doing with the plot and the world building, but I didn't quite emotionally feel it. I don't think that the artificial feeling totally went away from me. Yet there was one character in the book, the one that's on the cover, that I did enjoy in the story most of the time. I wouldn't say he's like a new favorite of all time, but I did start to become more and more curious about this character. And by the way, I love the Michael Whelan art in this story. I think it's gorgeous. I think one of the themes that Friedman is exploring is about evil, using evil as a tool. You get a religious platitude statement about that towards the beginning. But as you use evil, the presence of it may dismantle your identity and make it all the more difficult for you to recognize what is evil and what is not evil. There is some exploration of that, in addition to looking at thirst for power and different ways of looking at power, too. I think that shows up in 3 different characters in different ways. In addition to power, we get this aspect of vanity for male characters. I think there were so many things to appreciate that Friedman did in this story, but I just didn't emotionally feel moved by it, and I wish I did. The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro is a fantasy standalone. It was published in 2015, and Ursula K. Le Guin hated this novel. I'll get to that in a bit, but first I'll say that, like many of Ishiguro's books, this deals with memory. But unlike some of his other books that deal with memory, such as The Remains of the Day, Never Let Me Go, A Pale View of Hills, unlike those books, this one deals with not only the power of memory, but also the power of forgetting. How forgetting our past can shape us, how it can dictate relationships. And there's also conversation in this book, or questions in this book, about the benefits of forgetting, the consequences of forgetting. It's looking at both sides of the equation with memory and forgetting. It doesn't provide a moral answer to those questions, but it gets you to reflect and explore those things. And I would say it does so while also bringing in elements such as vengeance and betrayal and some other things in the story as well. I'm going to go ahead and get to what Le Guin said about this book and explain some of the things that won't work for a lot of readers, including Le Guin clearly. And that has to do with the fact that this is a fantasy standalone, but I don't think that you read this for the fantasy elements, though the fantasy elements serve the story. That is how I see it. So I'll go ahead and read the quote from Le Guin and then carry on from there to explain. This is from the end of the article, by the way. I will link the full article in the description. I respect what I think he was trying to do, but for me it didn't work. It couldn't work. No writer can successfully use the surface elements of a literary genre, far less its profound capacities for a serious purpose, while despising it to the point of fearing identification with it. I found reading the book painful. It was like watching a man falling from a high wire while he shouts to the audience, "Are they going to say I'm a tightrope walker?" Okay, so those are Le Guin's thoughts. I am a Le Guin fan. I have respect for both authors, and I respect what Le Guin is saying here, but I also see it differently than she does. And I think this is because this is not my first Ishiguro book. I have read other Ishiguro books before, and I've noticed how he uses other genres in his writing, but he's not beholden to those other genres in the way that he approaches his themes and his storytelling. And one of the aspects of Ishiguro's storytelling, in addition to the way he plays with genre, is what I describe as a very minimalist way of writing. He's very much a minimalist when it comes to character development, setting description, and the history of the world, those aspects. He's very minimal when it comes to those things. That's not to say he's poor in writing those things, but he gives you just enough to fill in the lines. He gives you just subtle touches of these things, and he leads you with breadcrumbs to something he wants to explore. This book is no different from his other books in that regard, even though this is his only fantasy standalone. But for a fantasy reader, for somebody who's going into a fantasy book and wanting to have this magical experience, the fantasy elements are very basic. And it pains me to say this because I love the book. But the fantasy elements, such as mythical creatures, you have fairies, ogres, and some other mythical creatures, they are very basic. You have magic in the world. You have this mist that causes people to forget. The setting descriptions are good, but they're not incredible. They're not innovative in any way. So it is very basic when it comes to those elements. It is not a novel experience. It's a novel, but not a novel experience. But that said, all of those elements are used very purposefully as symbols in the story, as motifs in the story, leading you on this deeper exploration into the question of memory, again, and forgetting. And just to give you a little more summation of what we're dealing with here, we have a couple, Axel and Beatrice. They are an elderly couple, and they one day remember, because this mist, again, causes people to forget, they one day remember they have a son who lives in a far-off village, so they must make a journey to go and see their son. Along the way, They meet a Saxon warrior. They meet a young boy. They meet an elderly Sir Gawain. And so that's when you get the idea that we are in post-Arthurian Britain, because Arthur is dead at this point. Not really a spoiler, but we are in peace times in the land. They meet these characters. They crisscross with these characters, I should say. They meet these characters, part, cross again, and it's kind of a merry-go-round in terms of that. And then we end up where we end up, and we are left with this very poignant ending, in my opinion. I was very moved by the end of this story, and I couldn't stop thinking about it for days. But that said, there was part of me that almost felt like I was reading a parody of the fantasy genre in some ways, but not in a bad way, and I don't feel like it was all silly. It was certainly funny at times. I think the humor was intentional at times. However, there were some dark elements, some unexpectedly dark elements, and in fact, especially with one character, every time he came on the page, I felt like we got a darker layer of history or what his mission was in the story. I was really impressed again with where the story ended up, and especially with the foreshadowing that happened along the way. So for me, this worked, and I find it so odd that it worked because I can understand where Le Guin was coming from, but I felt very differently. And it's interesting that this worked, whereas I feel like the fantasy elements, like I said, were very cookie cutter in a way, and yet this book, the Coldfire Trilogy book, Black Sun Rising, had such an attempt towards creating something that had depth and intense emotion and melodrama, and it didn't quite work for me. It felt more artificial for me, even though there was an attempt towards that verisimilitude versus this book. This one made me think about my own relationships more. It made me think about my most cherished memory with my husband. It made me think about things in life that maybe I wish I could forget. It made me think about forgiveness and whether that's possible sometimes. It got me thinking about a lot of things. Now, were there parts of the book I didn't like? Yes, there were parts of the book that I didn't quite totally connect to. I think there were parts in the book that had a purpose, but the purpose eluded me. From here, I'm going to talk spoilers, which is something I rarely ever do in this kind of video, but I really want to talk about the ending. So spoilers for The Buried Giant. If you haven't read this, bounce off here. And if you've read this, please stay and give me your thoughts. So I'm going to go ahead and talk through the end of the book here. I read this, by the way, I should have said this at the beginning. I read this with Murphy and with David from Four Corners of the Page, Murphy Napier and David. And I think we all had the same interpretation, which is that Beatrice dies. It was clear that she was probably dying the whole entire book. I think that was pretty clear. But it was a little unexpected that she went by herself, that Axel didn't go with her. And yet I think there was some foreshadowing for that, because throughout the book, there was mention about how whenever they were on a path that was too narrow, it was always Beatrice who walked in front rather than Axel. And then throughout the book, anytime they were walking somewhere, and that was the case, which was often, she was constantly calling out, "Are you still there, Axel?" And he's like, "I'm still there, princess," which is so sweet how he called her princess. Anyway, that happened throughout the book, and I chuckled every time it happened. But then when she crossed over first without him, he wasn't there. She went and she left him behind. And there are so many different ways to interpret that ending. And I really need to hear thoughts, if you've read this book, how you interpret it. That foreshadowing was so striking because throughout the novel, Beatrice seems to be worried about Axel leaving her behind or separating from her. And he's constantly having to reassure her that he's there and he won't leave her. And there's some memory in the past which makes her feel abandoned by him. Earlier in the book, we have an encounter with the boatman, and then at the end of the book, we have an encounter with a different boatman, but they serve the same purpose, which is to take the couple across the way to the island. In this case, Beatrice and Axel want to see their son at the end. And the idea is that most couples don't get to go together or be together on that island unless their love is pure and true. And that's the other reason why it was surprising Beatrice went first, because anytime we came across these women, we came across these widows who were left behind. It was never the case that we came across men who were left behind. It was always women. And he, the boatman, has to interview the couple individually to find out if they are worthy of making that trip together. So their love gets tested in this interview process. Now, when they encounter the boatman at the beginning of the story, the boatman discloses, it turns out they meet him by chance apparently, and he discloses that the interview question is, what is your most cherished memory of your significant other? At the end of the book, Beatrice talks freely to the boatman to the point where he felt like he didn't have to ask much. He doesn't tell us what she discloses. Then when he talks to Axel, Axel ends up sharing a very similar joyous memory. But then as he talks to Axel and they're walking towards Beatrice, he asks Axel if there's a memory that still causes him pain from all their years together. And he claims this is not part of the interview. Axel reveals the story of infidelity, how Beatrice cheated on him, how they split apart, how their son ran away, upset about what he saw between them, how their son died of the plague. And with all of those details, the boatman shares that Beatrice said as much. But then Axel takes it a step further. He ends up disclosing that as a petty dark vengeance towards Beatrice, he forbade her from seeing their son's grave. And that, the boatman says, Beatrice did not share. Then after that, we learn that the boatman is only going to take one of them across at a time and assures them they'll be together and all will be well. But we can't help but wonder, is this boatman a trickster? Did he trick Axel into sharing that information? Did this answer change things? Did the memory stain the relationship more than Axel is willing to admit, or that Beatrice is willing to admit? Axel seems to be of the opinion that these darker parts of their past are part of the whole of their love. That love is more complicated than just good times. That there are bad parts, but it's still love. It's still as true as ever. There's also a question earlier in the book when he asks Beatrice if the mist could have been a good thing. Could it be our love would never have grown so strong down the years had the mist not robbed us the way it did? Perhaps it allowed old wounds to heal. So you also wonder if the mist really did heal those wounds, or whether the wounds still lingered, whether they would still have been together all those years if the mist hadn't come. There's so many questions that it leaves you with, and it's so sad that Axel goes on without Beatrice at the end. Wait for me on the shore, friend, I say quietly, but he does not hear, and he wades on. So haunting, so poignant. Of course, there's more to say about the mist's function for peace times between the Britons and the Saxons and what will happen now that the mist is gone. But I was so haunted by that last conversation. Feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. That is it for the books I read in January and February, or all the books I've read in 2026 so far. If I had to pick a favorite book in January, it would have to be Golden Foal by Robin Hobb. And as for February, it would be A Song for Arbonne if I count rereads, but if I'm not counting rereads, I think it would have to be The Buried Giant by Ishiguro. Ishiguro just hasn't missed for me so far. This is not my favorite of his books, but I still got a lot out of it. So please let me know in the comment section below what you've been reading, if you've read any of these books, if you're planning to read any of these books. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.